5:58 a.m. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu Island. The Hawaiian sky was lightly veiled with thin clouds, a northeast wind whispering around 12 knots, and the sea lay almost flat, disturbed only by the faintest ripple. Battleships, painted in somber gray, were moored in precise rows within the bay, their hulls catching the first blush of pink light from the nascent dawn. A sentry on the USS Arizona, battling the salty chill, glanced at his watch and turned up his collar, unaware that 6 Japanese carriers were steaming north, over 230 miles away, and that their aircraft were already halfway to their target. On the Akagi, flagship of the First Air Fleet, Admiral Nagumo stood at the edge of the deck, listening to the Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers coffin to life. Each aircraft carried a Type 91 torpedo, its warhead packed with approximately 450 pounds of explosives. The torpedoes were fitted with wooden fins, crucial for enabling them to run in waters shallow within 45 feet. Once launched, they would race toward their targets at roughly 42 knots. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers ascended, carrying 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs, ingeniously converted from 16-inch naval shells. Nagumo remained silent, observing each aircraft as it lumbered towards a bow. A war was about to commence, waged with human hands, powered by oil and executed with unforgiving steel. In the chart room, an officer meticulously traced the American supply line, marking its path through Midway, Guam, and the Philippines. Red dots indicated the locations of B-17 bases. The officer knew that if those bases survived the impending attack, Japan's maritime lifeline could be severed. Every moment that passed without discovery increased the odds of a successful strike. At Pearl Harbor, 6:10, American sailors stirred awake to the relaxed rhythm of a Sunday morning. Some queued for breakfast, anticipating coffee and bacon. On the USS West Virginia, a machinist retrieved a photograph of his wife and young son from his locker, placing it carefully on top before descending into the depths of the engine spaces. At Hickam Field, young pilots joked about a baseball game planned for later in the day. P-40s and B-17s were parked wingtip to wingtip as a precaution against sabotage, inadvertently transforming the airfield into a densely packed target. The Opana radar station had detected a massive blip, but the report was dismissed, the signal casually attributed to incoming friendly B-17s. The Japanese formation coalesced into its final attack line, skimming under 200 feet to evade detection and threading their way through scattered clouds. Radio communication was reduced to terse code. The signal Tora, Tora, Tora was held in reserve, waiting for a precise moment when the target's unpreparedness became undeniable. A Kate pilot touched a cloth charm tucked inside his flight suit, recalling his mother's letter, carefully folded small, "Don't let your heart freeze." The paper lay against his chest, trembling in sync with the powerful 1,000 horsepower engine. Oahu materialized ahead, the harbor opening like a vulnerable bowl. Lieutenant Commander Fukuda peered through his bomb sight. 7 American battleships lay neatly arranged side by side, floating in water barely 40 feet deep. Shore batteries remained silent and still. From 10,000 feet, he released a flare, a silent spark signaling the commencement of the first wave. From initial sighting to the first shot, the American reaction time would be measured in mere seconds. The first wave plunged earthward. The base siren sounded a beat too late. Torpedoes were released, each one hitting the water, leaving a telltale white wake, and streaking directly toward the unsuspecting hulls at near right angles. A lookout on the USS Oklahoma managed to shout aircraft just before the devastating blast slammed into the deck. Within 5 minutes, the Oklahoma had absorbed at least 4 torpedoes, according to some accounts, and began to list dramatically before capsizing and rolling over. Men trapped inside heard the agonizing groans of stressed steel and desperately tapped out SOS signals against plating that was over an inch thick. On the Arizona, an armor-piercing bomb penetrated deep, detonating near Turret 2. The resulting shockwave ignited the 14-inch magazines, causing the main shells, each weighing around 1,400 pounds, to explode in a catastrophic chain reaction. A column of fire erupted, soaring over 650 feet into the air. At 8:06, the ship broke in two. Approximately 1,177 men perished aboard, a staggering casualty rate representing almost the entire on-duty crew. In those initial moments, there were no statistics, only screams and the acrid stench of burning oil slicking the water. American anti-aircraft fire began to awaken. Twin 5-inch/38 mounts unleashed a torrent, firing about 15 to 22 rounds per minute per barrel. 20mm Oerlikons and 50 caliber Brownings joined the fray, but many guns were still without ammunition. Barefoot sailors raced across scorching decks, passing ammunition belts and hauling wounded comrades to safety. A petty officer, his voice cutting to the rising panic, blew a whistle and barked, "To stations! Fire at will!" The order spurred men into action. Across the anchorage, crews improvised damage control. Men wrestled hoses that could deliver 100 to 150 gallons of water per minute, desperately trying to smother the raging fuel fires. Others flooded empty compartments to counteract the growing list, counting down the seconds between each new impact. For a fleeting moment, the air crackled with desperate calculations. How many guns were operational? How many shells per minute could they fire? By 8:10, over 100 anti-aircraft barrels were firing, filling the sky with thousands of rounds, yet the attack continued relentlessly through the gaps. Zero fighters strafed Wheelerfield, firing in short bursts to conserve ammunition, each pass lasting only a few seconds, but long enough to set dozens of parked aircraft ablaze. 8 P-40 exploded before its pilot could even taxi. At Hickam Field, a fuel shed absorbed a 550-pound bomb, the resulting pressure wave shattering windows over 300 yards away. A signalman, his ears ringing, clung to a phone, relentlessly dialing. The second wave was inbound. Amid the chaos, a few Americans managed to get airborne. Welch and Taylor scrambled their P-40s from Haleiwa and clawed upwards, managing to down several Japanese planes, according to some reports. Each gun carried only a few hundred, 50 calories rounds, with a firing rate of around 800 per minute. So every trigger squeeze sent shudders through the airframe. They witnessed battleships capsized and the shoreline consumed by flames. They had no way of knowing that this was only the opening hour of a war that would stretch from the Aleutians to Guadalcanal. On the USS Nevada, the crew desperately tried to get underway to clear the channel. The boilers were only partially lit, steam pressure hovering near 200 psi, not yet at cruising level. The ship, however, still inched forward. Gunners swung the 5-inch mounts to starboard, firing upward in steady streams. A bomb struck near the bow, ripping open the deck and killing or wounding approximately 60 men in a matter of minutes, according to some sources. The Nevada continued its agonizing crawl into the channel, shrouded in black smoke, a defiant signal that the fleet was not completely immobilized. In a shore hospital, nurses lined stretchers in neat rows. They cut away burnt shirts and rinsed wounds with saline solution. A doctor scribbled frantically on tags: shrapnel, burns, fractures. No one could yet calculate a casualty ratio. They only knew that every ambulance siren heralded the arrival of another body slick with oil, eyes wide with shock. A young sailor gripped his friend's hand and tucked a soot-smeared family photo into the man's pocket, offering no words. Outside the window, the smoke hung as thick as fog. In Washington that night, cables from Hawaii turned white with urgent telegrams. In Tokyo, the embassy had still not completed delivering the formal declaration of war. War, however, waited for no paperwork. It erupted on a calm bay in the clang of metal and the suffocating stench of burning fuel. When the first wave retreated from Oahu, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a zone of safe distance. 10:02 a.m., December 10th, 1941, off the east coast of Malaya, South China Sea. The air hung heavy, hot and humid. Low clouds scattered across the sky. Visibility around 5 miles in the sea state of 3. 2 British capital ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were steaming away from the shoreline, attempting to intercept a Japanese landing convoy. They were making roughly 25 knots, sailing without fighter cover. On deck, sailors tasted engine oil mingled with rust, their eyes anxiously scanning the empty sky. European strategies were ill-suited for this theater. There was no North Atlantic fog here, only tropical air and an enemy that attacked from low altitudes. From the north, over 80 Japanese aircraft rushed in at staggered altitudes. G-3M Nell and G-4M Betty bombers carried Type 91 torpedoes, the same deadly family of weapons used at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese commander split his force, high-altitude bombers leading the way, followed by the torpedo planes closing in behind. The combined roar of twin engines echoed like a swarm of angry insects. On the Prince of Wales, anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Twin 5, 25-inch mounts fired at a rate of about 7 to 8 rounds per minute per barrel, while 40mm pom-poms hammered away in flickering bursts, unleashing roughly 115 to 120 rounds per minute per barrel. But the sky was thick with targets. Japanese attack density surged to dozens of bombs and torpedoes per minute within the critical engagement window, according to some reports. The first torpedo group skimmed in under 100 feet. A British spotter yelled into the voice pipe, "Hard to port, full speed." The bow swung, but the torpedoes were too fast. One impact struck on the port side, sending violent jolts through the ship and flooding the engine rooms. The outboard shaft jammed, causing a dramatic drop in speed. 2 more torpedoes slammed into the underwater belt. The rhythms of the anti-aircraft fire faltered. Sailors desperately fed ammunition belts into guns by hand, their mouths filled with the acrid taste of cordite smoke. Repulse managed to evade several early runs, her hull weaving like a massive fish navigating turbulent surf. But by 12:23, she absorbed cluster hits, listed heavily, and began to sink. The Prince of Wales followed at 13:20. In a single afternoon, Japan demonstrated the vulnerability of heavy surface ships operating without adequate air cover in the age of modern air warfare. An entire naval doctrine collapsed in the bright, unforgiving tropical waters. Simultaneously, the war fractured outward, spreading like a chain reaction of snapping links. In the Philippines, 8 a.m. December 8, 1941, Clark Field. The sky was clear, but the wind was sharp. American B-17s and P-40s were caught on the ground while refueling. 60 to 250 kilogram bombs rained down in precise lines, tearing apart runways. Aircraft burned before they could even taxi. The U.S. Far East Air Force lost most of its striking power in a single day. From that moment forward, the Philippine sky no longer belonged to them. On Guam, in the early morning of December 10th, Japanese naval guns initiated the takeover. 127 to 140mm batteries sent shells in steady pulses, a countdown to the impending landing. Gunners ranged by eye and by the use of targeting tables. Every minute, dozens of rounds crashed into hastily prepared defensive positions. U.S. Marines, armed only with light weapons, sought cover in shallow trenches, barely 5 to 6 feet deep, dug into the unforgiving coral. Coral dust and the stench of burnt metal permeated everything. They fired M1903 rifles in bar bursts, but their lines were relentlessly suppressed by naval gunfire and mortars. Guam fell in 2 days. On Wake Island, 11:50 a.m. December 11th, under a bright sky with a light east wind and glaring white coral beaches, Japan launched its initial landing force. But U.S. Coast Artillery 5-inch/51 127mm guns were already pre-sighted and ready. Their effective range extended over 5 miles. As Japanese destroyers closed, the American guns responded with slow, deliberate, and accurate fire. The Hay took a direct hit and disintegrated. The Kisaragi was struck by a bomb from an F-4F Wildcat, detonating her depth charges and reducing her to a burning wreck. It was one of the rare American victories in the opening week of the war. On the sand, Marines relayed whistle signals and passed boxes of 30-06 ammunition hand to hand, their lips gritty with coral dust. Wake held out for nearly 2 more weeks before the overwhelming force broke its defenses. Small victories, however, did not alter the broader strategic picture. Japan drove along a broad arc. Malaya was severed, Hong Kong fell, and Borneo and Celebes were squeezed. Each offensive followed a consistent pattern. seize airfields first, fly in fighters second, and then use those fighters to provide cover for transport ships. Air and sea became inextricably linked. The United States and Britain could not yet match the relentless Japanese tempo. On Bataan, in late December, American and Filipino trenches stitched together the jungle roads. Averaging around 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, they were fortified with roofs of timber and sandbags. The tropical winter rains transformed the soil into a clinging, gluey mud. A Filipino rifleman crouched, wiping rust from his Springfield rifle. A photograph of his sister hung from his shoulder strap. At night, he wrote on dam paper, "If I don't come home, remember I stood here." He folded the note and tucked it into his steel helmet. At dawn, Japanese 75mm guns began their preparatory barrage from 4 to 5 miles away. Each blast shook the trench walls, showering dirt across his neck. American submarines attempted to retaliate, but the chaos only intensified. A Sargo-class boat lay submerged at 200 feet off Luzon, listening to the screws of Japanese transport passing overhead. The captain calculated 1,500 yards, 90-degree track. Mark 14 torpedoes left the tubes, ran a few hundred meters, and then either detonated prematurely or slid harmlessly beneath the target, victims of well-documented design flaws. The crew clenched their jaws, knowing that they were hunting with flawed weapons. The escalating crisis was fueled by a fog of incomplete and often misleading information. Americans had no clear idea where Japan would ultimately stop. Japan, in turn, was uncertain when the United States would mass its forces for a counterstrike. Radio was both a vital lifeline and a potential source of vulnerability. On December 31st, at a field wireless station in Java, a British sergeant slammed down the key and transmitted a coded plea for support. The reply was only static and more bad news. Dots on the map continued to fall like relentless rain. By early January 1942, the strategic balance had clearly shifted. Japan held the operational advantage through speed and surprise. The Allies retreated from island clusters, desperately trying to construct a new defensive line around Australia and Hawaii. But in the ashes of defeat, something else began to take shape. The dawning realization that the heart of this war was in the sky and the radio wave, not on armor-plated gun decks. Survivors from the Prince of Wales described aircraft arriving like a waterfall, torpedoes striking like sledgehammers, and the sea swallowing old pride whole. Those stories circulated through bases and letters home and in hurried strategic reappraisals. The Pacific was now a theater where anyone who couldn't adapt quickly enough would be crushed. 4:20 a.m., June 4th, 1942, northeast of Midway Atoll. The sky was pale gray, low clouds hanging in the air, and light swells rolling over the dark blue sea. An easterly wind blew at about 15 knots. On the USS Enterprise, a short, reveille whistle cut through the damp air. Deck crews jogged across a surface slick with dawn mist. The smell of aviation fuel and salt hung heavy in the throat. This was the morning the Pacific would be irrevocably transformed. Far out, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu Hiryu, slid into launch positions. They believed that Midway would fall that day and that the U.S. Pacific Fleet would rush in to be destroyed. Before sunrise, a Japanese scout flight ran late by several crucial minutes. One cruiser failed to launch its float plane on time, according to some accounts. A small timing error drifted unnoticed in the clouds. Japan remained unaware that 3 American carriers were lying in wait to the east. The first Japanese strike force radioed back from Midway. The island was not neutralized. Another attack was needed. On the Akagi, internal bells rang urgently. Ordnance crews began switching the loadouts of the aircraft, replacing armor-piercing bombs with fragmentation bombs. Carts rolled, locks opened, and fuses were swapped. The hangar deck was packed with fueled aircraft. Bombs lay staged, ready for deployment. Cables snaked across the steel deck. It was a flying warehouse, not a combat-ready deck. They were standing on the precipice of ignition. Meanwhile, the Americans launched their counterstrike. Torpedo squadrons from the Hornet Enterprise and Yorktown lifted off. TBD Devastators were slow, with a top speed of around 205 miles per hour, and they had to fly low to release their Mark 13 torpedoes. The torpedoes were known to have defects, running at the wrong depth or failing to detonate, according to some reports. The pilots went anyway, fully aware that Japanese anti-aircraft fire would be a cage of unrelenting flame. The torpedo planes arrived first. Japanese Zeros dug like deadly knives, their 7mm and 20mm guns stitching the air with lethal precision. Shipboard Type 96 25mm mounts fired at a rate of about 110 to 120 rounds per minute per barrel, creating thick curtains of tracer fire. Devastators fell one by one. Of 41 torpedo planes, only a handful returned. The casualty rate was almost total, but they drew the Zeros down low, away from the high altitude, diverting attention and absorbing fire that would otherwise have been directed at the incoming dive bombers. At about 10,000 feet, SBD Dauntless dive bombers broke through a gap in clouds. American pilots spotted the Kaga and Akagi below, bathed in the thin sunlight. They rolled over into near-vertical dives, plunging earthward at angles of 70 to 80 degrees, their speed building past 250 miles per hour. A 1,000 pounds, about 454 kilograms, bomb was released, falling like a hammer. The Kaga absorbed multiple hits on her flight deck. Gasoline ignited, blooming into massive fireballs. Unsecured bombs detonated in sympathetic explosions. Flame raced along the deck like spilled oil. The Akagi was struck at least once near an elevator. A single bomb was all it took. Fuel, munitions, and parked aircraft transformed the carrier into a raging furnace. 6 minutes later, the Soryu was also burning. 3 Japanese fleet carriers were removed from the war in a single, brutal span of time. The reversal happened in minutes, not months. Shock paralyzed the Japanese decks. The Hiryu, however, was still operational. She counterattacked immediately. The Hiryu launched dive bombers. D3 Avals rolled cloud lines towards Yorktown. U.S. 5-inch guns unleashed a pattern barrage, time-fused bursts filling a segment of the sky. Still, a few managed to break through. 3 250 kilograms bombs slammed into Yorktown, starting fires and causing her to list. Damage control parties sprinted into burning compartments, coupled hoses, cut electricity, and flooded counterweight tanks. They managed to bring the ship back on an even keel in about an hour. Survival became a practice rhythm. Clamp, douse, patch, breathe. Torpedo planes from the Hiryu arrived low. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port side. Power failed. The carrier ground to a halt. Sailors jumped into the oil-slicked water, clinging to rafts and watching their ship sink inch by agonizing inch. But they also knew that American bombers were already airborne, carrying the final answer to the Hiryu. SBDs from the Enterprise, and from Yorktown's own air group, launched before she lost power. Found the Hiryu. They dove again. Bombs punched through the deck and ignited the hangar. By evening, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were either sunk or abandoned. America lost the Yorktown and many airmen, but Japan lost the offensive backbone of its navy. From that point forward, Japan could not replace carriers and veteran pilots fast enough to sustain the relentless pace of the war. The third crescendo did not end at Midway. It spilled into the South Pacific. 6:14 a.m., August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal's beaches. A brief squall passed, followed by intense sun. The jungle was dense, the ground a mixture of black sand and salty swamp. U.S. Marines waited ashore, their boots sinking into the muck. They seized a half-built airstrip that would later be named Henderson Field. From it, the Cactus Air Force flew daily missions, striking Japanese supply ships. Japan responded with the Tokyo Express at night. Destroyers sprinted at 30 to 35 knots, unloading troops and supplies in minutes, then vanishing back into the darkness. The island war became a merciless grinder. Trenches about 5 to 6 feet deep cut through mud and tangled roots. Naval gunfire pounded the coast. U.S. 155mm artillery fired 2 to 3 rounds per minute, tearing holes in the green wall of the jungle. 81mm mortars cracked and thumped. A Marine, weakened by malaria, still held his position in the line. A sergeant kept a waterproof letter in his blouse pocket. During a brief lull, he unfolded it and caught one line, "Remember you are loved," before the alarm whistle shrieked. He shoved it back and ran to his foxhole. On the Japanese side, a private concealed a wedding photo inside a tobacco pouch. At night, he heard whispered orders and the short bugle calls of assault units. They charged across grass illuminated by American flares. Browning M1917 machine guns fired about 450 to 600 rounds per minute, sweeping low. Many attackers fell before even reaching the wire. Casualty rates in some night assaults climbed past 50%, according to some reports. They kept charging for orders, for honor, and because retreat was no longer an option. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. Initiative shifted fully to the United States. The island hopping campaign began. B-24s and submarines strangled Japanese logistics. Radar, radio direction finding, and coordinated carrier task forces became standard doctrine. Every subsequent battle, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, flowed directly from Midway's hard-fought pivot and Guadalcanal's brutal attrition. Strategic consequences manifested clearly on maps. Japan's offensive perimeter contracted westward, losing its outer arc. The U.S. constructed a corridor to the Philippines and on towards Okinawa. Technology accelerated. Improved naval radar, American torpedoes finally corrected, escort carriers flooding the sea. Doctrine shifted decisively from battleship decisive action to carrier air power and logistics dominance. Numbers hardened into memory. Tens of thousands dead on Guadalcanal. For Japanese carriers sunk at Midway, torpedo pilots flying into near certain death to open the sky. Personal legacy survived in small objects. A scorched photo mailed back to Iowa, a salt-stained letter folded in a Tokyo rucksack, a chipped whistle hanging in a museum case. Survivors carried the sound of Midway's morning engines and Guadalcanal's wet jungle smell for the rest of their lives. The Pacific War began with shock, but it turned with bloody learning. Its memory continues to shape how the world understands sea war. Whoever owns the air owns the ocean.